Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a warm and cozy fireplace, and like usual, let's start by sketching it out. Since I want this fireplace to be at the center of the composition, since I want it to be the focal point, I started out by measuring the center point of my sketchbook vertically, and I'm going to use this as a guideline to draw out the fireplace itself, which consists of simple shapes like rectangular boxes and long lines for the pipes and such. As for the design, you can also create your own, but I personally just want a rustic fireplace, which is why I chose this shape for mine. I'm just going to keep things fairly simple here. Then once I'm done with the fireplace, I'm going to add the decorations around the room. On the right hand side of the fireplace, I'm going to add more firewood stock, and I'm going to include different types of wood stored in different casings for different shapes and textures in the composition. Then I'm going to add the rest of the cozy items. As you can see, I'm drawing loosely because I'm still trying to map out the objects just to get the ideas out and try out different compositions I have in mind. Also notice how I'm holding my pencil quite far back. This helps with the looseness of the sketch and the speed of the sketch as well, because we are not putting too much pressure on the point of the pencil and adding too much detail at this point. I just want to put in the items that I have in mind efficiently at this point. I know it's winter, but I still want to include some greens in the composition because I just find that leaves make the composition a bit more alive. So I'm going to add some hanging plants on top, and of course in front of the fireplace I'm going to add a carpet to make the composition a bit more cozy. And I also find that having the carpet kind of bring the composition together. Now on top of this carpet you can add in your favorite cozy items. So here I'm including a blanket, a couple of mugs, and you can also add different designs for the mugs as well, but I'm just going to keep things simple. I'm also going to add a plate of cookies. On the right hand side, I drew a basket of yarn, but I decided to take off the basket and just draw a single ball of yarn instead. And in the middle of the carpet, I'm going to place a sleeping cat. You can also draw a sleeping dog if you want, or even any pets that you have at home. I'm just going to keep the shapes fairly simple because there's a lot going on, so I don't want to include too much detail. I just want the main shapes of all these items or all of the elements for the composition. I'm fairly happy with all the elements that I've included so far, but looking at this whole composition, I felt like it's out of balance because the left side is quite empty compared to the right, so I'm going to balance it out by adding a simple rectangular pot with some branches. While I was sketching, I also added some Christmas decorations that was maybe left there and haven't been cleaned out, but after I was painting it, since there was already a lot of things going on, I kind of just painted over it and I didn't end up putting the decorations. But if you do like the look of it with the bubbles, you can also add them on. In front, I also added a couple of cushions, and here I'm just going to add extra detail to the fireplace. I also drew out a circle for the background because I want the background to be confined in a limited space, since I wanted to have a brick texture, and I just find that having the brick texture in a confined space brings the whole composition together, just like the round carpet in front of the fireplace. Once I have all of the elements down, I'm going to clean out the outline, and I also want to lighten the outline for areas that I'm going to paint quite lightly, like the pile of wood on the right. Next, here are the colors that I'm going to be using. This is Burnt Umber by Holbein, Graphite Grey by Daniel Smith, Indigo by Schmincke, Crimson Lake by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, and Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke. I'm also going to be outlining using my Sakura Micron pen. This is in the color Sepia and the size is 005. Okay, so let's begin to paint. I'm going to start by painting the fire in the fireplace. I started with the dominant color being Hansa yellow to paint the shape of the fire in the middle. This is mixed with a bit of vermilion to make the yellow a little bit deeper. And as I move outwards, I'm going to add a bit more vermilion to create this orangey color. I'm going to keep expanding the warmth by adding even more vermilion in the mix, and each time I add a deeper, darker color, I want the previous color to just be a little bit damp, so whenever I'm introducing the different tone, the paint won't run into each other. As I'm getting closer to the edge, I'm going to introduce a bit of Crimson Lake into the mixture, and this will create an even darker red. Then right at the very edge, I'm going to add a mix of Vermilion, Crimson Lake with a bit of Indigo. This contrast in value is what's going to give the warmth and the brightness or the glow of the fire, so make sure to use a medium to thick consistency. For the metal around the fire, I just added more indigo and also a bit of graphite gray. And I'm just using a medium consistency to paint all around. I'm going to paint per section so I can keep each section separate. And I'm also using a fairly light brush load as I'm painting each section, so it doesn't take too long for each area to dry. Moving on to the outer portion, again I use a mix of indigo with a little bit of graphite gray, and I'm using a medium consistency yet again with a medium brush load in order for me to cover this larger space, but I want to make sure none of the area is puddling so it can dry fairly quickly. The previous area turned out to be a bit too light, so I ended up painting over it while leaving a bit of negative space, so there's a line separating each of those areas. While I wait for the previous area to dry, I'm going to paint the top using a slightly thicker consistency so the top is a little bit darker in terms of value. I left out this area to separate the spaces, but I'm still going to paint it later on. Once the paint settles, I use a thinner consistency of the same mix to paint the line in between those two areas. And I'm going to do the same thing for the pipes as well. If you're a bit lazy like me and you don't want to wait for each area to dry, you can either use a hairdryer to make the drying process quicker, or like me, leave out a little bit of line or negative space in between so the paint doesn't run into each other. Once I've painted the base color, I want to start adding on a slightly thicker consistency, especially around the edges of the pipes. This will just give more of a three-dimensional form, so the pipes look more cylindrical. Then I just use a clean damp brush to soften the transition. And those are basically the steps. I'm just going to keep painting the rest of those separate areas for the fireplace. Once I'm done with the fireplace, I'm going to move on to the other elements. I'm going to paint this tin bucket. I basically just added more graphite gray into the indigo, creating a slightly different tone, and this time I also used a really light consistency for a light gray. Next, for the square basket, I use a mix of burnt umber with a little bit of Hansa yellow and vermilion. After I've covered the whole area and the surface is still a bit damp, I decided to add a slightly thicker consistency, especially around the bottom. I've left out a bit of white space for the handle, and in terms of the color, I used the same mixture as before, but with added indigo and graphite gray to make the brown more muted and darker. Next, I'm going to paint the candle with a mix of Hansa yellow, vermilion, and Jaune brilliant dark in a very thin consistency. For the candle holder, I want it to be either like bronzy or copper in terms of color. And for this, I use the same mixture as the basket, which is from burnt umber as the dominant color with a bit of Hansa yellow and vermilion. While I'm painting the candle holders, I'm applying the paint similarly to how I painted the fireplace, separating each area and also leaving out a bit of white space in between so the paint doesn't run into each other. I also left out a bit of white space in the middle of each area to show a little bit of highlights and suggest that this material is a little bit shiny. After the surface is more or less dry, I then added a slightly thicker consistency around the edges, and this will also add a bit more shine. For the pile of firewood, I'm going to paint all of them using a mix of Jaune Brilliant Dark with a bit of burnt umber and Hansa yellow in a light consistency, while leaving the top face completely white for now. Then I'm going to go back in to the larger wood, and I want to give it a bit of texture using a slightly darker brown by adding more burnt umber in the mixture. To create the texture, I like to paint vertically following the grain of the wood, and I slowly build up the darker brown by adding a bit of indigo in the mixture to make the brown a bit darker and more muted. I also use a slightly thicker consistency. Then using the same mixture, I'm going to add a bit of texture to the lighter, smaller wood as well. This time I'm painting spots horizontally, but while doing this, I want to also be mindful of the cylindrical form. So instead of painting completely straight horizontal lines, I'm making them slightly curved. As for the top face of the wood, I'm using whatever is left on my brush with a little bit of indigo to make the color even more muted. As for the top face of the larger wood, I basically use the same color as the bark, but in a lighter consistency. For the smaller chopped firewood in the bucket, I'm just going to use the same color and leave it to dry for now. For the vase, you can pick any color that you want. Since I have a lot of colors that I've pre-mixed already, I just picked up the warmer brown and use a light to medium consistency to paint the whole surface. Next, I'm going to be painting the rug. Sorry, I've been calling it carpet, but I think this is a rug. But I started out by using this brown because I wanted to create a little bit of warmth for the area that's closer to the fireplace. So I used a mix of Hansa yellow and vermilion to create an orangey tone, and I mixed it with the green, and then it just turned to be brown because they're almost opposite colors. But I just tried to work with it and continue with the green as I progressed to the side and the center as well as the front of the rug. For the green itself, I use a mix of Hansa yellow and indigo, and if you want the green to be a bit muted, sometimes I would add burnt umber or crimson lake into the mixture as well. Since I'm going to be adding layers for shadows and things like that, I'm using quite a light green for now, and I'm just going to spread it out in a light to medium consistency to cover the whole rug. I decided to use a slightly darker value of green around the sides, and this just has a bit more indigo in the ratio. I'm still trying to create a slightly lighter value around the middle where the light hits it directly, but I still want to use a fairly light consistency so it doesn't overwhelm the composition since I'm still going to be layering on the shadows. Here I'm using a light consistency of a mix of Hansa yellow and vermilion just to indicate and remind myself where the light's going to hit on certain objects. For the rest of the smaller items, you can use any color you'd like. For the blanket, I used indigo with a bit of Hansa yellow and Jaune Brilliant Dark, and as for the pillow, I used Jaune Brilliant Dark with Crimson Lake. I personally like adding Jaune Brilliant to the hues to turn it into pastel tones, so they stand out against the richer muted tones of the rug and the surrounding items. For the floor here, I used the brown that I already pre-mixed on my palette, and I just added a bit of Hansa yellow to make it a little bit more golden and warm. Personally, I want the cat to be white, so I'm just going to use a bit of gray to indicate the shadows for the cat in a very light consistency. This is the part where I start to add a bit more shadow and the light reflection as well. So here I'm adding a bit of the yellow tone in certain areas where I feel the light from the fire will be reflected on certain items. Here I'm also using the grayish blue that I already have on my palette to add some shadows. To darken the color of the shadow, I would just add more indigo or graphite gray or mix both of them. And most of the shadows will just be directed right under the items since the light source is mostly coming from the back. Next, I'm going to add the details for the rug. I'm just using the consistency of the brown that I already had on my palette to add the design of the carpet that I sketched out. And then I used the same mixture for the base green of the rug to add the fringe. And I'm just directing those lines according to the angle as if I'm directing it right at the center of the oval. And as for the fringe close to the light source, I used the brown to make it cohesive with the color of the rug. I also used the same green mixture from Indigo and Hansa Yellow to paint the leaves. After this, I'm going to paint the texture of the brick wall. In terms of the color, I used a mix of Jaune Brilliant with Burnt Umber, Vermilion, and Crimson Lake. To paint the bricks, I'm going to switch to my flat brush here, and I'm basically just painting dashed lines while leaving a little bit of white space. And I'm going to alternate the spacing to create the brick texture. For the areas which are interacting with the items in the foreground, you can either use the side of the flat brush, or personally, I find it much easier to switch to my round brush for those smaller, tinier spaces. Since I've painted the right hand side first, it's a little bit difficult to paint the left side and aligning it to the right since I wouldn't be able to see the right hand side. So we decided to rotate my sketchbook so I can paint it vertically. This way I can follow the brick lines that I've previously painted. As you can see, I'm painting the bricks over the branches that I previously sketched out. And this is not going to matter because I'm going to use a thick consistency and a darker brown so the brick won't show through as I paint the branch later on. When I was painting on the bricks, I thought that it looked nice if the brick doesn't cover the whole background. I quite like the difference in texture and I was thinking of painting the rest of the wall using a flat color. However, I felt like I needed to add one more brick line so the flat color won't be too large and overwhelm the composition. However, as I was painting the additional bricks, I ended up painting too much of it, which covered more area than I previously planned. So I ended up covering the whole background with the brick texture, but I ended up darkening the bottom area. So there are two colors for the bricks. One is darker and the top area is a little bit lighter. For the darker bricks, I just went over using the same color again, but in a slightly thicker consistency, while leaving the top area as the base color. After this, I'm going to add on the shadows for the items again using the bluish gray mix from Graphite Grey and Indigo. It doesn't matter if it has other colors as well. I quite like the difference in tone and it makes the painting a bit more loose this way. And I'm also going to start adding on the details on the blanket and the cushions as well. I just picked up whatever warm and cool colors that I had on my palette to add some patterns. For the very top part of the wall, I kind of want a different texture. I didn't, however, want to add the texture. I just want to suggest that this is wood because of the brown tone. In terms of the color, I just used the same color as the basket. Then after that, I've pretty much painted all of the elements, so I'm going to add some outlines to the items. This is just to define the shapes further. and I find this also adds a looseness and also more character to the painting. As I'm outlining, I'm also going to add some textures here and there and also some additional patterns if I feel the need to, especially for this tin bucket here. I also add some woven texture for the basket to give it a bit more character. I'm just doing dashed lines going vertically and horizontally, but you can create other textures that you have in mind. After adding on the outline, I forgot that I haven't actually painted the branches, so here I'm using a dark brown mix from burnt umber and indigo in a thick consistency. This is also when I decided that I'm not going to add on the baubles because I felt like there's already a lot going on after I've painted everything. However, if you still want to add on the bubbles, you can also use bleed-proof white or white gouache to create a white base, and then you can use any hues that you would like to paint on top of it. For a little bit of extra design, I felt like adding this pattern on top of the fire, and I just like the look of the silhouette. And I'm also going to add more details to the rug as well. I'm just adding simple details like lines with different spacing. For some final touches, I'm going to add some additional shadows and textures. Like for this vase, I just didn't like how flat it looked, so I ended up adding some vertical lines, which I then smudged to soften it. And since I've painted the shadows quite lightly on certain items, and I also forgot to paint shadows on other areas as well, so here I'm just layering more shadows to redefine them. For the shadows directly on the items, I like to find a tone or a darker tone that is similar to the base color. But just like before, you can also add other hues as well. I just find that this would add extra interest to the painting. So this painting is basically done, but I don't really like the darker bricks being accurately aligned to the fireplace, so I decided to extend the darker brick on one additional line. And that's basically it for this painting. If you guys enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, please consider subscribing. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!